Hello, my name is Derek Scasta, and today I'm going to be presenting about feral or wild horses, um, based upon some investigations I've been doing with my co-author, Michael Adams. Dr. Adams and myself have been digging into the social and ecological characteristics about horses in the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. I currently have several projects working on horses here in Wyoming, including their distribution and their use of the landscape. So this map is a good starting point for the discussion about horses globally. So this map comes from a 2015 paper that looked at a geographic assessment of wild living horses, or free roaming horses, if you will. And you'll just note that there's horses in North America and South America. There are also horses in the southern portions of Africa. This is actually something I've just recently began to learn about, which is interesting because there are native equids there as well. Certainly Australia has a very high number of horses. There's horses on the North Island of New Zealand. And then there's horses throughout some locations in Europe and Asia that are of importance to the issue. As the foundation for this presentation, I recently traveled from the United States to Australia and New Zealand to meet with a wide variety of stakeholders to just gather a more comprehensive understanding of feral horses globally. So much of my experience is in this high desert region of the United States, including Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and actually parts of Nevada and California. My time in Australia was spent primarily in Kosciuszko National Park, which has some of the only alpine areas in the country. And then I also was fortunate to visit the North Island of New Zealand, where they have the Kaimanawa horses, and was there while they were actually doing a muster or a gather with helicopters. So this table has a lot of important characteristics to help all of us better understand the horse issues in these three countries. Um, in terms of populations, Australia has the most horses. Population estimates are over 400,000, and there are estimates that suggest it could be closer to 1 million horses. New Zealand doesn't have near as many horses as either Australia or the US, with less than 1,500. Most of these are on the North Island, although I recently found out there may be a small population on the South Island as well. And then in the United States, the population estimates are somewhere between 100,000 to 200,000, and that number is a little bit nuanced because the numbers that are typically reported are only for lands managed by BLM and doesn't include tribal lands. Today, the estimate of horses on tribal or Native American Indian lands is over 90,000. In terms of ecological concerns and horse welfare concerns, those exist in all of the countries that I've been in. One difference, though, is the federal protections. So in Australia, generally there are no federal protections, although that could be changing because the jurisdiction is different. So it's largely state by state, and there's been some proposed legislation in New South Wales that's currently being considered. In New Zealand, there were federal protections specifically for the Kaimanawa horses established in 1981, and consequently the jurisdiction is primarily for the Department of Conservation to manage those horses. They work with the Army because the horses are on an Army base, and they work with some private partners as well. In the U.S., the federal protections were established in 1971 and primarily given to the federal government. One other really important aspect to horses in these three countries is their native status. So horses were not native to Australia or New Zealand. As a matter of fact, there were no native hard-hoofed animals in those countries. But equids or horses were native to the United States. They went extinct about 10,000 years ago, not before they moved over the land bridge and moved throughout the rest of the world, particularly into Europe and Asia. And so it's important to note that the horses of today in these countries were either introduced for the first time or reintroduced. In Australia, that was in 1788. In New Zealand, that was 1814. In the United States, that was 1493. It was actually Christopher Columbus's second voyage where it was documented that there were horses on board. And then in all of these countries, horses are recognized for some cultural heritage values at different levels with different formal designations of that. For the next couple of slides, I've got some pictures just to give the audience in the conference visual appreciation of the different environments where these horses occur and the places that I've been investigating some of these features of horses. So this is a picture from the Red Desert of Wyoming. This is land owned by the Bureau of Land Management, or the BLM. It's a really cold, high altitude steppe-like environment. Very harsh. It's really amazing that these horses are able to persist here. Horses also occur in Canada. These two pictures came from my colleague, Dr. Sonia Levirkis, who is located in Fort Nelson, British Columbia. There's also guide horses, which I would consider semi-feral, in that they are free roaming for much of the year until they're needed for the packing, guiding, trail riding, and hunting seasons. In this picture, you can see brumbies, or feral horses, in Kosciuszko National Park, which is located in New South Wales, Australia. And finally, here you can see horses on the North Island of New Zealand at the Waiouru Army Base, pretty much in the center of the island. And all of these places, you'll note, are really harsh terrain. Topographically, they're very difficult, and they're areas where these horses seem to thrive. So as I mentioned, it's really important to understand the origins of equids as we begin to talk about the designations as feral or native or wild. And in North America, this is where equids originated. And there is an estimate that there were 12 species or more. And these species were really variable in terms of their physiological and morphological features. So the two pictures here come from the American Museum of Natural History, and you can see two very different equids. So at the top we have Hypohippus, which was a very small three-toed browsing equid, and at the bottom you can see Dinohippus, which was a single-toed grazing equid, much more like the domesticated or wild horses of today. 20 million years ago they crossed over into Asia, and then approximately 10,000 years ago, it's thought that they went extinct. The causes for that extinction in North America are complex, and they include things like disease, environmental changes, and then probably human hunting as well. So now for a bit, we'll focus on horses in Australia. And unfortunately, my colleague, Dr. Adams, couldn't be on this recording, but some of this information is information he's compiled. So in this map, you can see the distribution of feral horses in Australia, and the red circle is where Kosciuszko National Park is located, and where Dr. Adams and I have spent some time on the ground with managers, advocates, the general public, the media, talking about and trying to understand more of the social aspects of horses. So this area is known as the Snowy Mountains of Australia, and the horse population here is arguably the most contentious in the country, regularly attracting widespread media coverage. Kosciuszko was successfully gazetted as a reserve in 1906, 1944, and 1967, the region having previously been extensively grazed by cattle and sheep for more than a century, and then used by Aboriginal people for millennia. And indigenous people were dispossessed through the introduction of those livestock, which were then themselves mostly removed to create a conservation landscape, which also excluded indigenous people. And Aboriginal people sometimes managed to maintain connection to country through working in the stock industry, and today hold strong memories of those experiences. So here's a map of the park. You can see in the dark green, and the small symbols show where horse populations are known to occur. The park is along the border with the state of Victoria, and to the south, and then to the northeast with the ACT, or the Australian Capital Territory. Within the boundaries of the park are 4 ski resorts and a hydroelectric scheme, and almost all mountain streams have actively managed population of introduced trout that displace native fish, which really adds to this discussion about feral versus wild. Free-ranging horses here are called brumbies in the country, and they've been established in the region since prior to the park's inception and are now estimated at over 6,000. It's important to know that Kosciuszko contains sensitive alpine habitats and species potentially impacted by horses. An extensive consultation program produced a wild horse management plan in 2016 that proposed reducing the horse population over a 20-year period to 600 using trapping, rehoming, and possibly ground shooting. Here you can see an image from the park with brumbies in it, just to give you a visual impression. And again, here's another image from the park, just to give you more of a visual appreciation of the subject matter that we're talking about now. The Wild Horse Management Plan of 2016 was actually overturned this year when the local member of parliament successfully introduced a new bill to parliament to declare horses in the park as heritage animals. And that legislation, known as the New South Wales 2018 Kosciuszko Wild Horse Heritage Act, has been met with hostility by conservation and scientists, but has also been seen as a win for horse advocates. And this situation continues to be really polarized. So last week there was actually a conference called Feral Horse Impacts, the Kosciuszko Science Conference in the national capital. You can see the flyer there in the bottom left-hand part of your screen. They're really focused on this issue from a science perspective. This week, there's also another high-profile recreational equine event that's going to showcase Brumby training and riding qualities at the Australian Brumby Challenge at Equitana in Melbourne. So you can see that flyer on the right. So it's interesting to just compare and contrast these two equine-related activities that are almost co-occurring in time right now. To talk about horses in Australia, we have to talk about Aboriginal people. Local Aboriginal people near Kosciuszko have said, "Our old people were animal lovers. They would have great respect for these powerful horse spirits. Our people have always been accepting of visitors to our lands and quite capable of adapting to change so that our visitors can also belong." And that's a quote from ABC. Here you can see two side-by-side maps. On the left is the distribution of feral horses in Australia, which I've shown you. On the right are Aboriginal indigenous lands, and these are color-coded for land rights and reserves in 2013, those with exclusive possession native title, and those with non-exclusive possession native title. And certainly there you can begin to see some overlap between horses and these indigenous landscapes. For Aboriginal people in Australia, horses and other newly arrived domestic animals found a range of places in their societies and livelihoods. Anthropologist Natasha Finn in 2017 argues that they adopted another kind of coexistence with these animals that did not include retaining them within a domestic fear over successive generations through control, capture, and containment. Across Australia, many Aboriginal people worked in the pastoral industry and developed a strong identity with cattle and horse work, which is still common across northern Australia. David Trigger argues that the animals known to have established themselves in Aboriginal traditionally significant landscapes through the history of settlement are understood to be sentient objects standing in a meaningful relationship with people in ways that overlap with, yet also remain in many respects different from native animals. That description more closely resembles white Australians' relationships with companion animals than free-ranging domestic animals or native animals. So there's a general Aboriginal culture opposition to killing to waste, both from a cultural perspective that values and respects non-human lives and from a related economic perspective. That it is necessary to take a life and the outcome should be useful in some way, either directly as food or other resources, or more directly as income. And particularly in remote Australia, there are some very limited economic opportunities, and harvesting wild introduced species, including camels, goats, water buffaloes, and horses, are all sources of work and then income. Researchers Varzan, Morell, and Edwards, in relation to feral camels, quote an Aboriginal man as saying, "You can't just shoot animals for nothing. It must be for a purpose, like eating." And they stress that the cultural importance of, quote, maintaining respectful social relationships among humans and non-human actors, including country. Anthropologist David Trigger highlights what he describes as Aboriginal intellectual generosity and asks, in light of Aboriginal creative responses to introduced species, how should Australians define who and what belongs in the landscapes of their society? And it's this notion of belonging that's at this core of this conversation about feral organisms. Political ecologist Audra Mitchell in 2018 described contemporary conservation practice as, quote, managing life and death processes, and argues for a move towards indigenous frameworks that are, quoting Glenn Coulthard, informed by what the land as system of reciprocal relations and obligations can teach us about our lives in relation to one another and the natural world in non-dominating and non-exploitive terms. This stands strongly counter to conventional command and control approaches used in conservation management, feral animal control, and agriculture. Management of native and introduced species is escalating in attention in the context of the contested ideas of the Anthropocene. Connecting this to analysis of the relationship between environmental management and indigenous dispossession challenges these binary or dichotomous ideas of feral and native. So now we'll shift our focus onto the United States. So this map shows the lands that are administered by the Bureau of Land Management. These blue polygons are herd management areas, or HMAs, for horses only. The orange polygons are HMAs for burros, and then there's one or two that have both horses and burros. And you'll note that what this does not include is locations where horses occur on tribal lands, lands owned by Native American Indian tribes, of which there are significant horses, particularly in the southwestern regions of the country. So to understand horse numbers in the United States, we have to understand some of the technical jargon that is used, and one of those is an acronym called the AML, or the Appropriate Management Level. This is the level where the number of wild horses and burros can thrive in balance with other public land resources and uses. And this is established in the Federal Protections for Horses, and that is set at 26,715 animals. Today on range, we have a total of 72,764. We also have in temporary holding over 47,000 horses and burros. And then, as I've mentioned, there's an additional 90,000 or more horses on tribal lands. So here in this graph, you can see the total horse and burro population estimates on range since the inception of the Protection Act in 1971. And then we've zoomed in here from 2007 to 2017, and you can see this really dramatic increase of over 4,000 horses and burros per year in the United States. So to really understand the horse issue in the United States, it's important to understand the different pieces of legislation that have been passed guiding management decisions. So in 1971, the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act was signed into law by President Richard Nixon, and this was in a large part a product of a lot of public activism. Out of concern for declining horse populations and then concerns about how these horses were being treated. This act mandated the management, protection, and study of, quote, unbranded and unclaimed horses and burros on public lands. And then really it established the jurisdiction of the federal agencies, specifically the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, and the U.S. Forest Service, which has a small number of horses. However, that act alone is not the standalone end-all be-all to horse management. In 1976, FLPMA, or the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, was passed, and this act really established this concept of multiple use, or using public lands for many different purposes, including ecology, conservation, agriculture, ecosystem services. It also established authority for the use of helicopters and motor vehicles to gather horses by these agencies after public hearing and then in accordance with humane procedures. And then in 1978, the Public Rangelands Improvement Act was passed, and this was implemented to improve conditions of public rangelands, and this mandated that an inventory of animals on public lands be conducted and develop this AML number, or appropriate management level. And then it recommended humane adoption or disposal of excess wild free roaming horses and burros. As you get into horse research and you kind of navigate a bunch of different circles of interested parties, you really quickly come to realization that there's this tension between the term feral and the term wild. And really, these are human or anthropogenic epithets that both have connotations and meta narratives of their own. Unfortunately, they can be used interchangeably a lot, creating some confusion about what they actually mean. Um, and so I think we need to be really explicit in how we use these terms. So these different connotations range from very protectionist to reductionist, and they also have bearing on this concept of non-human agency, which for horses is really an important consideration. For any animal, it's an important consideration. So the term wild has really positive connotations, including ideas of nobility, romanticism, and mystery or freedom. Whereas feral has really negative connotations, includes undertones of pestilence, and not being a legitimate part of the ecosystem. Um, what I hear a lot of is this movement kind of towards this more neutral term of free ranging or free roaming horses, and that's been common in many of the countries that I've either worked in or visited with. This is a paper that really illustrates this tension between feral and wild designations. So this is from the journal Geoforum. It's a 2006 paper that's addressing some horses that were in south central Missouri, which is really in the southeastern United States, out of the general area that I showed in the map where horses occur. And there was a lot of discourse about a really small number of horses from this national park service area. Really 25 to 30 horses were the only horses in the protected area. And there was a lot of legislative and legal movements and positioning. The media was involved, and then community protests and meetings. And then ultimately, there was a 1996 Omnibus Parks and Public Lands Management Act, which had an amendment ordering an end to any removal efforts. What's interesting about this paper is this distinction between feral versus wild. So, to government scientists and managers, the animals represented a feral and exotic species with no legitimate place in this agency-controlled ecosystem. But to members of interested parties, an activist group that were opposed to the removal, these horses had critical historical and cultural importance as icons of regional identity and history, and then as symbols of communities that were economically marginalized. So really small case where disagreement was really divisive, and a lot of the disagreement can really be summed up in the assigned term of feral or wild. So I'm a rangeland ecologist, and much of my work is very biological in nature, measuring soils and plants and animals. But in the context of horses and horse management, much of the decision making is driven by humans or social aspects to the situation. Specifically, horse advocacy, in some cases, I would say horse activism and emotion. And there's this great disconnect between emotion that's kind of recognized and persistent, and then unrecognized aspects to it. So the recognized emotional concern is for horse welfare and persistence. But what's unrecognized is these horses that are free roaming on native rangelands rely upon those rangelands to provide everything that all wildlife need and all livestock need, and that's space, food, and shelter. And there's a real disconnect between the emotion for horses and the emotion or concern for rangelands and native flora and fauna. That then leads me to this question of why is it so difficult to separate horses and humans, especially emotionally? And I go back to this coevolutionary history between humans and horses. So some 6,000 years ago, we suspect horses were domesticated by humans, and that largely transformed human history as we know it. All aspects of life changed, from travel, herding, warfare, trade, commerce, recreation, etc. And we can look at art to give us examples of that transformation. So here on the left, we've got a mounted Mongolian warrior riding his horse. This is definitely a war culture. On the right, we've got Plains Indians in North America with their horses, and they had to adapt to these horses that were reintroduced. But once they did, it drastically changed everything they did. And this transformation was not limited to North America. And the ties to indigenous people are really strong. For example, in New Zealand, as I mentioned earlier, I believe the first horses were brought by a missionary as a gift to a Maori chief. So very directly, this introduction was immediate. And for many of these groups, horses essentially raised one's status. It's providing a reproducible and self-sufficient resource that's a tool. It changed how effectively you could fight, commerce, how that was conducted, and then daily life. And there's a big if people groups had adequate forage and space for those horses. So here's some early photographical evidence of some of this. The bottom left is a photo from 1890 from Morrow's book Wild Horses of New Zealand. And so New Zealand's First Nation people, the Maori, adopted and managed herds of horses very soon after European colonization. And Maori women were also frequent users of horses in this new kind of horse culture as it developed, and then kind of waned and disappeared ultimately. In the center we have American Indians. So this is from Montana, the Flathead Reservation. This is from the National Museum of American Indians, and this is in 1905. And then here on the right, this is a photo from circa 1935 by Mountford, and this is an Aboriginal individual kind of showing how they embraced horses and were really tied to horses in the whole livestock industry that developed. So horses transformed indigenous lives in many countries. And I think at the core of this human-horse relationship is this initial impression that many indigenous people had the first time they saw a European riding a horse. And it really captures this essence of this difficulty in just thinking about and conceptualizing horses. These indigenous people at times perceive the horse and rider as functioning as one. So that demonstrates this really close bond, this close functionality between humans and horses that they had never seen, and they didn't even really know how to process. And if you can keep those historical developments in mind and fast forward to today, we can start to think more about horses and how we're managing them today. So in the U.S., we have over 40,000 horses that are now in temporary holding facilities. This picture is from a federal holding facility about 200 miles west of where I live in Rock Springs, Wyoming, where they can accommodate a lot of horses. These horses are arguably not free roaming at this time, and their future is very uncertain. And there's a number of other concerns that are arising today, one of which is economics. So this is a paper by Garrett and Ali looking at this cumulative cost of managing horses in the United States. So in this graph, you've got the number of horses in captivity on the right, you've got the cost in millions of dollars on the left, and then you've got this projection out to 2029, 2030. And so in 2016, you can see this expenditure of a little over 200 million, 76 million of which was for adoption and relocation. And if nothing changes, what is projected is that the cost of temporary holding facilities alone is expected to reach 500 million US dollars. And so for the taxpayer, for the average citizen, this is something to at least pay attention to. An additional concern that's very high profile, it's often pitched as the main concern, although I would argue there's other concerns that I'll get to, but it's this potential conflict between horses and livestock. And horses are really fundamentally different from a morphological and a physiological perspective than domestic cattle and sheep, and then native species here in North America like elk, deer, and pronghorn antelope. Um, Morphologically, they have upper incisors or upper front teeth that allows them to potentially graze at a lower level than, say, cattle or sheep that have an upper dental pad. Certainly, I'm not sure of any comparisons between horses and sheep, but there have been comparisons showing this between horses and cattle. But then horses also have a different digestive physiological design, and that is they're what we call hindgut fermenters. Here in this panel B, you can see the cecum is highlighted. That's the primary compartment for fermentation. It's behind the small intestine, and that's different than livestock and native wildlife for the most part that are ruminants or foregut fermenters. And here in panel A, you can see the rumen. That's the primary compartment for fermentation. It's in front of the small intestine. Consequently, horses have this high intake digestive strategy. So passage time is much quicker in horses, about half of the time from front to back than, say, cattle. And consequently, efficiency is much lower. So horses are really adapted to eat a lot of low quality forage. And because of this, a horse and a cow of equal size, if they were put on range, that horse would eat more forage because of this high intake, low efficiency strategy than cattle. So this is a big concern. And then the management in terms of the timing, the intensity, and the duration of grazing on public lands is also a concern. So in this picture here, this cow has a certain allotted time, usually just a few months. There's only a allotted number of animals that can be there, and then they have to be removed according to the public lands grazing permit. Whereas horses can be largely unmanaged, especially if there's no removal or population management that occurs. In the western United States, there's also concern about a ground nesting bird called the sage grouse. Sage grouse live in sagebrush plant communities where many horses also co-occur. And we know that nesting success of sage grouse can be negatively influenced by overgrazing. And in this figure here, this map, you can see the gray areas. The light gray are the current sage grouse range for the greater sage grouse. In Colorado, there's another population called the Gunnison sage grouse. And then you can see these outlines for BLM horse herd areas and herd management areas. And then the dark spots are BLM herd management areas that overlap with current greater sage grouse range. And for example, in my state of Wyoming, this exceeds 99%. So there's really strong overlap. Anywhere there's horses, it's really important sage grouse habitat. Very little is known about how horses might be either altering habitat features or their physical presence as far as having an impact on these birds. And these birds have been petitioned to be listed under the Endangered Species Act in recent times, although they have been found to not be warranted. They are a species that a lot of people are concerned about their persistence in populations. There's also concern in the western United States about how horses are displacing or otherwise affecting some of our large game species. And so this has become something of interest to our wildlife society, which is our professional wildlife group in the U.S. And so this is their magazine, The Wildlife Professional. They picked up on this, and this is a picture from Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado, where horses were dominating a spring water source and actually displaying aggressive behavior in running elk off. And elk are a quite large native ungulate to North America. In terms of other native ungulates, there's also some folks that are worried about how horses are affecting pronghorn antelope. And just like the sage grouse, antelope are really characteristic species of this sagebrush ecosystem. And my state of Wyoming has pretty much the majority of pronghorn and sage grouse in all of North America. So that's a big concern. Their physical presence may displace antelope, especially from water sources. On the right here is a recent paper by Hall et al. In the Journal of Arid Environments, and this just looks at species richness of A, all species, B is birds, and C is mammals. And you can see here that there are areas that are either horse excluded on the left or horse had access to the water. In every case, there was greater species richness where horses were excluded. So the presence of horses around water has a negative impact on species richness. Here's an example of some work we're doing with GPS collars on horses here in Wyoming, trying to better understand how they distribute across the landscape and then overlap both jurisdictional boundaries and then wildlife habitat. So this mare here in the bottom left had a GPS collar all of last year, 2017. This is the data from that year. And you can see here her 95% and her 50% home ranges. So if we look at her 50% home range, 37% of that's actually in Colorado, so she's crossing state lines. And then she has overlap with crucial range for antelope, 100%, mule deer, 41%, and then sage grouse, 40%. And then in this map, it's important to note the yellow is federal land, whereas the white and the blue is private and then state land, both of which can support these federally managed animals. There's also a lot of concern about how horses are affecting ecosystem function. So this is a paper published by Boyd, Davies, and Collins in Rangeland Ecology and Management, where they looked at horse excluded and horse grazed areas in the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge, where there are no livestock, so it's excluding any effects of livestock grazing. And here you can see pictures of horse excluded and horse grazed areas along these riparian corridors. And then you can see the associated data, whereas stubble height of the vegetation and visual obstruction is much lower in these horse grazed areas. And these would be areas where sage grouse, the bird we were talking about earlier, would come to raise their brood and find the insects necessary for their diets. This is an important part of sage grouse life cycles as well. Now I want to begin to make some linkages as I wrap up between the different countries that Dr. Adams and myself have been working in, and in particular the United States and Australia. There are ecological concerns in both of these countries which are very similar. So the plants and the animals might be different, but the concern about how horses impact those plants and animals is essentially the same. And the pictures here showing the fence line contrast come from the conference abstracts from the recent feral horse impacts conference in Kosciuszko, and you can just see excluded areas to the left, and you can see the plant community, compare that to the right. In the top right hand corner is actually a picture I took from some long-term grazing exclosures in the southern part of Kosciuszko, right near the Victoria border. As a matter of fact, it's right on that border between states, and you can see not only the vegetation but the soil and how it's responded to this horse grazing. And what's at risk to me is really native plants and animals. In this picture here in the bottom right, again from the conference abstracts there, this is a mountain pygmy possum, essentially an endemic small organism that is potentially at risk as we debate about and maybe manage or mismanage horse grazing. To integrate all of this information then leads us to this really big challenge that I think human society has to really begin to address. And underlaying that is how we designate horses with the terms of feral or wild or free roaming. And that challenge is we have to link the emotional concern for horses, concerns that are evident here. We have this extremely emaciated horse that had to be emergency gathered. Horses have been found dead in shrinking lakes or wet areas stuck in the mud, dying from dehydration and then physical immobility. We have to link the emotions that come from those images with the recognition of the central role that rangeland resource sustainability plays into horse management. That is the sustainability of soils, plants, and animals. And in my opinion, we really need to move towards evidence-based management. One of the best examples I've seen of this was when I went to New Zealand, and the Kaimanawa horses was Horse advocate groups were leading the adoption program in collaboration with the Department of Conservation and the Army. And they were basing their numbers on the population estimates and the thresholds for numbers of horses. So, in other words, advocates accepted the government's recommended number of horses and wanted to help the government manage for that number, where they articulated they felt like horses were healthier. If we can do that, or if we don't, there's big consequences for native ecosystems and for horses. And it's going to be hard to watch. I mean, these images evoke a lot of emotion. That's a very difficult situation to observe. And finally, I'll wrap up with this last image. Again, from New Zealand, this is the muster, which included helicopter gathering. But what's really cool about this picture is you see these three stockmen in the yard there, helping to move these horses around into the alley and into the pens, the yard. And with horses, we have to remember humans, through the domestication process, through colonialism and exploration, have moved horses around. So where horses are today is largely a product of human or anthropogenic movements. So debate about designations of feral versus wild have to incorporate the fact that humans have played a big role in where horses are. And we have to come to terms with that and not forget that there's this really tight human-horse association that goes back thousands and thousands of years. With that, I'll be online this week. We'll try to answer any questions. I appreciate the audience and the organizers of this conference. I want to thank my co-author, Dr. Michael Adams, and I look forward to engaging with folks online. Thanks.